Now, I know that the restrictions on communal worship have been really difficult for many people, despite the quite exceptional efforts made by faith groups to reach out to their communities. This change, again, is relatively minor, it is proportionate, and we believe that it can be achieved relatively safely, but it will hopefully enable more people to draw strength, comfort and inspiration from acts of collective worship. Presiding Officer, all of us, I think, can see that things are getting better just now. In recent weeks, we have seen a significant fall in new cases. Deaths and hospital admissions are thankfully now falling, and the vaccination programme is not just progressing well, it is progressing beyond our initial expectations. All of this is excellent news, and it provides really strong grounds for hope. But that hope must also be balanced by caution. Because we have been in lockdown, it's easy to overlook the fact that the virus we are dealing with now is much more infectious than the one we were dealing with in the autumn. But we will be reminded of that very quickly if we try to do too much too soon. And since we are prioritising the reopening of schools, our scope for lifting other restrictions, certainly in the next few weeks, is extremely limited. That's why the changes I have set out today are modest, but they are also important. They will, I hope, help people's health and well-being by enabling group exercise and allowing for a bit more social interaction. And they will also, I hope, let children see more of their friends and exercise and play a bit more normally. And they should, I hope, provide some comfort for faith groups. I expect that further, more substantial changes will be possible in the weeks ahead, and I will set out as much detail as I can about that in next week's statement. And of course, as I've said before, if the data allows us to relax more restrictions more quickly than we have previously indicated, we will not hesitate to do that. I am very well aware of just how difficult continued restrictions are, and I know that they get harder rather than easier to bear as time goes on. I also know, because I very much feel this too, that the progress on vaccination makes us even more impatient to reach the end of this ordeal as quickly as possible. But I am certain, absolutely certain, that easing restrictions too quickly would be a mistake that we would regret. So do take advantage of the relaxations set out today, but please continue to do so within the rules. We must still stay at home except for specific purposes, which from Friday will include limited outdoor socialising and recreation on the basis that I have set out. We must not meet people from other households indoors yet. That is absolutely essential, and we should all follow the facts advice when we are out and about. By doing this, we can continue to look after each other and protect the NHS, and we will all play our part in keeping case numbers down while the vaccinators continue to do their work, children get back to school, and we all take tentative, but I hope very firm steps back to life as we once knew it. So for the moment, please continue to stick with it. Please stay at home to protect the NHS and save lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, First Minister. I would encourage all members who wish to ask a question to press their request to speak buttons, and I call on Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I thank the First Minister for advance sight of her statement and echo her condolences to the families of those who have lost their lives. And I agree with her about the scenes in Glasgow at the weekend, when so many people have done so much over such a prolonged period of time. To see a tiny minority risk those efforts jeopardises the progress that we have made. And let's be clear, COVID is in retreat, and that is down to the perseverance of the public and the success of the vaccine rollout. And scenes like those at the weekend risks what has been achieved by the actions of all of us. Presiding Officer, as we relax restrictions, the Scottish Conservatives have always urged the First Minister to ensure that children's return to school was an absolute priority. The First Minister has claimed that too, and last week brought forward plans to get our pupils back into the classroom. She said then it was important for well-being as well as for education, and today she has referred to it as very significant steps. Because of the importance she gave it last week, parents who have spent months trying to homeschool and watching their children struggle away from their friends and from face-to-face teaching were expecting a significant change. It has therefore come as a shock to many to discover that when the letter came in, they were looking at something less than billed. Xanthi in Edinburgh says that for her family it is half a day per week, which she's called clearly ridiculous and a token gesture. Elaine in Aberdeen was devastated to be told that her son will have only 2 3-hour sessions this side of the Easter holiday. Alan in Fife says his daughter gets 1 day per week, but in return will now get no other live teaching time online, which he brands an absolute joke. Pupils and parents were promised to return to the classroom, but from the information they're now getting sent, it's clear that for many this will amount to only a few hours a week at best. Can the First Minister look those parents in the eye and say that this is the significant progress that she's claimed? And will she look again at these plans in order to increase the actual amount of teaching time that pupils will get?
First Minister.
I will always look parents in the eye and try to explain the difficult challenges that we're trying to balance. And I understand that few groups in society have found this more difficult than parents who have had to juggle childcare with working from home and all the other responsibilities that become are part of everyday life. So I understand how important this is. Let me be very clear. I set out clearly in Parliament last week that from the 15th of March, all primary school children will be back to full-time education in schools, and that is a significant change. And we will also seek to have some in-school learning for secondary school pupils in the period between now and Easter. It is the intention, assuming there is no deterioration in the position, that we will have full return after the Easter holidays. But instead of having some young people in secondary schools with no in-school contact at all, we've decided to try to do that, even if that is on a fairly minimal basis for the period between now and Easter, in order to try to reacquaint them with school, with their friends, and to prioritise their well-being. I don't stand here and say this is perfect, but we need to balance all of this to get schools back, and to get schools back in a way that doesn't then set back the progress of the country overall. And in terms of continuing to look at all of this, the Deputy First Minister does that on an ongoing basis with the partners in the Education Recovery Group to make sure we are striking the best balance and the right balance overall. But let me repeat again, the most important objective that we are seeking to fulfil right now is to get all young people back to school full-time after the Easter holidays. In the way that we did last August, that is what we are aiming for. And in terms of secondary school, to prioritise in-school contact between now and Easter for those in the senior phase, to make sure that national qualifications are being given the priority they deserve, but to get all young people in secondary schools with some contact back in school before the Easter holidays.
Thank you. Anas Sarwar, to be followed by Willie Rennie.
I thank the First Minister for advance sight of her statement and join her in sending our condolences to all those who have lost a loved one. The decision to allow more social interactions is very welcome. It's important for people's mental health and well-being, and that is why we also need to make sure that this is our last lockdown. But that will rely on testing, contact tracing and a speedy vaccine programme. Can the First Minister confirm that every contact of the patient with the so-called Brazilian variant, including every passenger on the flight, has been traced, notified and informed of the need to isolate? She mentions the rate of the vaccines. It has dropped dramatically. Can the First Minister confirm when she expects it to reach and remain at the 400,000 doses per week target, something that we're now currently around half at? And I share with her the sadness and anger at the scenes we saw in Glasgow at the weekend, which emphasise the risk that COVID-19 poses to those who continue to work on the front line. Given this and the further phased return of schools next week, will the First Minister agree, alongside the JCVI recommendations, that there should be vaccine prioritisation for frontline workers, including teachers, school staff and police officers?
First Minister.
Firstly, on the new variant, of course, we had 3 cases previously identified, and all appropriate contact tracing in relation to them has been done. I set out some of the detail of this at the end of last week. There were a small number of passengers on that flight who weren't able to be traced, but there is no indication of any onward community transmission from these cases. Similarly, the case that I've mentioned today is not connected to those 3 cases, and all appropriate contact tracing is being done. From the manifest data provided for this flight, there were 22 passengers on board, plus the cabin crew. Some 11 passengers, including the indexed case, went into managed quarantine. The remaining passengers were exempt from the need to quarantine. However, depending on the nature of their exemption, are likely to have been required to self-isolate at home and take tests on days 2 and 8, and all appropriate steps have been taken to follow up appropriately. Negative test results for both day 2 and 8 were recorded for 13 individuals, and the National Contact Tracing Centre are following up the other 8 passengers as well. So we will continue to make sure that everything appropriate there has been done. The most important thing to stress at this stage is there is no indication of onward community transmission of this variant, and that's what we need to work hard to continue to ensure. In terms of vaccination, I set out very clearly and very openly the issues around supply. We can only vaccinate as fast as we have supplies to vaccinate with. I have flagged up in advance that we were expecting a dip in supply, and indeed that materialised, and that is why we have seen a dip in the daily vaccination rate over the past period. If you look at the figures for other parts of the UK, you can see the same pattern reflected there. We are expecting now those supplies to pick up again from the middle of March, which will then allow us to work towards achieving that target of 400,000 vaccinations a week, and of course that overall target of completing the JCVI priority list by mid-April. That's priority groups 1 to 9, which, just to repeat, is the majority of the adult population. It's everybody over 50, all unpaid carers, all adults with an underlying health condition, and then of course we will move into the rest of the population. As we do that, we will follow JCVI advice. Their advice is that both in terms of clinical risk, but also in terms of the ability to work through this as quickly as possible, we should continue to prioritise by age cohort. And we will follow that advice, as we have always done with JCVI advice. Many teachers, many people in other key professional groups will already have been vaccinated as part of the priority groups so far, and of course they will progressively be done as we work down the age groups. If we were to depart from that JCVI advice, I think we would rightly stand accused of making political decisions in place of clinical decisions, and we're dealing with something as important and as sensitive as this. I don't think, while I understand the calls that are being made, I don't think that would be the right thing to do.
Thank you. Willie Rennie, to be followed by Patrick Harvey.
The breach by Rangers fans at the weekend was the biggest gathering this country has seen for months, and the Chief Medical Officer said yesterday that it could result in an increase of the spread of the virus. But the First Minister makes no direct reference to that in her statement today, and is bringing forward the relaxation of the rules. So does that mean that the First Minister is now confident there won't be an increase in cases in Glasgow as a result of the weekend? Is she confident there won't be an outbreak in Glasgow?
First Minister.
If I was to stand here and say yes, then I think people would realise that I wasn't basing that on anything. I said at the weekend that I was concerned that what happened in Glasgow could set back our progress. I fervently hope that won't be the case, but as we know with this virus, it will be some time before we know that for sure. And of course, our test and protect teams, our contact tracing, all of the other steps that we take, will be working very hard to ensure that any cases that do arise from that gathering at the weekend, or those gatherings at the weekend, are properly contained. But we've made the judgment, and as with all of these judgments, we've done it on the basis of clinical advice, that given the relatively minor nature of the changes that we are setting out today, given that they are focused very much on outdoor activity, it would be wrong at this stage to hold them back because of the behaviour of an irresponsible minority. But with all of this, we monitor on an ongoing basis. We are still monitoring closely the impact of getting schools back. It's why we have to get schools back cautiously and in a phased way. And it all comes back to personal responsibility. If all of us, desperate though we all are to do much more that we value doing in life, if we all take care to do that within the rules, then we can make sure that this journey out of lockdown takes no longer than it has to, and absolutely carries on with forward trajectory. But make no mistake, having crowds of people risks the spread of this virus, and that's why I say again, and I take no pleasure in saying this, people who gather in George Square or anywhere else in big crowds of people are putting their own health at risk, but they are also putting the risk of the health of their loved ones and the wider community at risk. And that's why I say very, very clearly, and again, I take no pleasure in saying this, that behaviour wasn't just irresponsible, it was deeply selfish behaviour. And when so many people across the country are having to make painful sacrifices, missing funerals of loved ones, not being able to get married, grandparents and grandkids not having seen each other for months, we all have to make sure that we are acting not just out of what we want to do, but out of what the whole country needs all of us to do. So I would appeal again to everybody, let's stick with this. We are so close to getting into a much, much better position. Let's not mess it up by any of us, for whatever reason, whatever circumstances, not sticking to these rules now.
Thank you. Patrick Harvey, to be followed by Christine Graham.
Thank you. Like everyone else, as we approach this grim anniversary, my thoughts are with those who've lost a loved one and with those whose health is still suffering. And I welcome the gradual releasing of some of the rules on meeting outdoors. We all miss mass gatherings. People miss mass gatherings of all kinds, whether it's music events, going to the cinema. Some people even miss party conferences. Myself, I'd like nothing better to go to a beer festival, but we don't. And the organisations and businesses that run such events have all had to stop until it's safe. Why should a football club be any different? A football club which, let's be honest, seriously did nothing to prevent dangerous mass gatherings in its name, gatherings which trashed the public realm, risked the safety of frontline workers, as well as posing a public health threat. Surely it's not enough just to appeal to the good sense of those who've shown they don't care. Why are we even contemplating letting this business carry on in the weeks ahead when we know it's likely to generate a repeat of the scenes we saw at the weekend?
First Minister.
I was just trying to work out there whether the beer festival and Green Party conference were distinct events or one and the same. Patrick Harvey, I think, makes really important points. Everybody is missing something right now. Many of us are missing many different things, mass gatherings, or just simple ability to go and see loved ones. And it is really, really hard. It's heartbreaking and gets more so with every day that passes right now. And I understand why for any football team winning the league, particularly after a long period of time, is a big occasion. I get that. But people are being asked to forego all sorts of things right now. And there can be no exceptions if we are, frankly, to get through this next phase as quickly as we want to and as safely as all of us want to. I have made very clear, Deputy First Minister did it yesterday, the Justice Secretary has done it again today. I think Rangers Football Club could have done more to help avoid this happening, just as I thought Celtic Football Club should have made different decisions about certain things they did earlier in the year. I am not partisan. Half of Glasgow think I'm partisan in one direction, the other half think it's in the other. I'm not at all. I don't care about the colour of the shirt. I care about the safety of the citizens of Glasgow, and indeed I care about the safety of people across Scotland. Rangers, I've had a 3-page letter from Rangers which doesn't even just reflect the fact that what happened at the weekend was deeply regrettable and that we all have to reflect on how we avoid that happening in future. At no point, unless I missed it, in which case I will have it pointed out to me and I will stand corrected, at no point did Rangers simply and unequivocally say to their fans, stay at home. Or when they were gathering, say, go home. So these are things all of us have to take responsibility for. I take responsibility for reflecting on whether the government could have done more, and I know the Chief Constable will be doing the same with the police. We all have a responsibility to get the country through this. In terms of future fixtures, I said in my opening remarks that there are a variety of discussions happening over the course of this week, including one between myself and the Chief Constable later today. We will report back on those in due course, certainly before the scheduled Old Firm match on the 21st of March. The reason we've tried to keep football and elite sport generally going is not for the benefit really of the elite sports people, but for the fans. Everybody's being deprived of so much right now that the ability to watch a football match and cheer on your team on the television should be something that people have the ability to do But a minority can't be allowed to act irresponsibly. So I hope we don't have to spoil that for the majority, but we will have to assure ourselves that there will be no repeat of the kind of scenes we saw at the weekend. And that, frankly, is still very much work in progress.
Thank you. Christine Graham, to be followed by Maurice Golden.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, we all welcome the phased return of pupils to school. However, in your statement, it is acknowledged that steps being taken to get pupils back may well lead to the R number being pushed above 1. Would this impact on the timetable for return to full-time education? And if so, would any changes be national, or could they be varied according to the R number either in a health board or a local authority area?
Firstly, what I said is the case that every change we make right now, there is no change we make coming out of lockdown that has a neutral effect. Every change as we ease up potentially increases the risk of transmission. What we have to do is behave in a way that minimises that, which is why when we had the first phase of school return, I said openly to parents, don't use that as an excuse to interact with other adults more than you are already. So if we limit these changes to what the purpose of them is, then we can reduce that risk. And while it is possible that the changes we're making right now will take R above 1, it is not inevitable, and we'll be working really hard to try to avoid that happening. In terms of if the virus starts to run out of control again, which I hope it won't, of course we would then have to review the pace of coming out of lockdown, and we will do that appropriately, whether that's national or local, depending on the circumstances we face. It becomes much more difficult to accurately assess the R number on a regional basis for methodological reasons. So we want to, at this stage, focus on having these changes happen in a way that stops the R number going above 1. And that is, so the outdoor changes, these are the least risky, and they hopefully will not have that impact if everybody enjoys them but stays within the rules. And that really is the message on all of this. If we all stay within the rules, even as we come out of lockdown, then we increase our chances of doing this safely, sustainably, without suffering setbacks along the way. But with an infectious virus, there's no guarantees. We just all have to stick with it and show the discipline that is required.
Maurice Golden, followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Hospitality is one of the hardest hit sectors in our economy. Will the First Minister listen to the Scottish hospitality and licensed leisure sector's proposals for reopening? And will the First Minister publish the evidence on the impact on coronavirus transmissions of restrictions within the sector?
First Minister.
I'll listen to the representations of all sectors. Hospitality has been hardest hit. They make and have made and will continue to make representations about how they can reopen in a way that is safe but allows them to trade more normally, and we will listen to that. But we have to make sure that any changes we make are not going to risk increasing transmission to the point where it sets us all back, and that is not an easy balance to strike. In terms of the evidence, I come back to the debates we were having before Christmas, before we went back into lockdown. The evidence can be made to sound really, really complicated here, but it's not. This virus spreads when people come together, and that's why it is places where people come together most and are more likely to interact without social distancing, or in places where ventilation is maybe not great, and unfortunately that includes a lot of hospitality premises. But we want to get hospitality open safely as quickly as possible, just as we do the rest of the economy.
Thank you. Kenneth Gibson, to be followed by Jackie Bailey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, in my constituency, luxury specialist food and drink shops rely on the passing tourist trade not just to thrive but survive. This all but vanished during lockdown, and North Ayrshire Council has denied grants vital to such business survival, saying that Scottish Government guidance deems specialist food and drink retailers essential and therefore not required to close. However, other local authorities have taken a completely different view of this guidance. So can the First Minister clarify if luxury food and drink specialist shops are essential, or can they close and therefore access the vital grants they need to survive?
First Minister.
Well, all of these restrictions are really challenging for businesses, as the legislation allows for shops that sell food and drink to be able to open but not the types of food and drink. It may be that some specialist shops are not experiencing the same footfall as they were before COVID. So the Local Authority Discretionary Fund, which the Scottish Government is supporting through £120 million of funding, was set up to help local authorities respond to local economic pressures in their areas. And I would encourage any businesses in that category to contact their local authority on this.
Thank you. Jackie Bailey, to be followed by Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Two concerns have been raised with me in recent days. Firstly, the 60-year-olds in my constituency haven't been called forward for a vaccination appointment, whilst 50-year-olds have, and it's of course the same local authority and the same health board area. But secondly, and worryingly, a large number of people have missed their vaccination appointments, 70 people in one local centre in one day. And given the high rates of uptake, this does seem slightly strange. There were issues last year in the flu vaccination programme when people were notified too late, in some areas after the date of the appointment. So could I ask the First Minister to investigate to what extent this is an issue with the vaccination programme and ensure that people are notified in adequate time?
First Minister.
If Jackie Bailey wants to send me particular examples of that, of course I will look into that. Since I gave an open invitation to people to email me directly on vaccination issues, then I can assure Jackie Bailey that many people are, and that option of course remains open. But the most important source of help and advice in these situations is the helpline, which I would encourage people to contact. On the issue about people 50 or over being called before people 60 or over, of course, if somebody in the 50 to 55 age group has been called right now, it is likely to be because they've got an underlying health condition and they have the same priority right now as people in the 60 to 64-year-old age group, and both of those groups are in progress in terms of the vaccination. Nobody's going to be missed. Everybody is going to be reached. By mid-April, everybody over the age of 50, which includes myself, will, unfortunately, I still struggle to come to terms with that, but will have been vaccinated, as every adult with an underlying health condition. That is the vast majority of the adult population, and then as quickly as possible we'll get to the rest of the adult population.
Thank you. Claire Adamson, to be followed by Jamie Green.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, I've been contacted by residents in Motherwell Wishaw with concerns about the lack of public transport to the Ravenscraig Mass Vaccination Centre. Indeed, it's something I raised with the Health Board a couple of weeks ago. Can I ask the First Minister what support has been given and provided by NHS Lanarkshire to facilitate transport and support those who may have difficulty accessing the centre?
First Minister.
Well, I've also had a number of emails on this issue in the last few days, so we've picked this issue up with Lanarkshire. The board is expanding its communications plan over the coming days to ensure that residents in Lanarkshire are aware of the rebooking options that are available to them. They're also currently working with Strathclyde Passenger Transport on improving transport connections with Ravenscraig. We recognise that not all vaccine slots are going to be suitable, which is why it is important that there is that option to reschedule appointments to a location closer to home or for a different time if that is more convenient.
Jamie Green, to be followed by Bob Doris.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Further to the various exchanges on schools, can I ask for clear confirmation that to facilitate the First Minister's promise of a meaningful full-time return to all school pupils after Easter, the guidance on social distancing in the classroom will also be altered to enable it to happen?
First Minister.
In order to get all young people back to school, then of course we have to make sure that the restrictions that are required are proportionate, and that includes social distancing. But these are the issues that we continue to take advice from our expert advisory subgroup on. We did, and people should remember this, we got schools successfully back full-time in August, and it wasn't school return that then sent us back into a deteriorating position and back into lockdown. So we know we can get schools back successfully, and that's what we're focused on doing again.
Bob Doris, to be followed by Daniel Johnson.
Presiding Officer, it's to be welcome that dates for easing some restrictions have been brought forward, and I particularly welcome the return of congregational worship in time for religious festivals such as Holy Week. But can I ask the First Minister, if the data continues to go in the right direction, could we see even more dates being brought forward? For instance, First Minister, with gyms reopening sooner than anticipating perhaps in level 4, something I know my constituents would greatly value, as we'd all like to see more things go back to normal as soon as possible, but of course as soon as it's safe to do so.
First Minister.
Well, in general, yes, as the data allows and as our confidence increases that we can ease up without risking greater transmission, the vaccine rollout has a big part to play in that, then we will accelerate exit from lockdown if we possibly can. And in fact, what we've announced today is an acceleration beyond what we anticipated just a couple of weeks ago. I don't want to give people false assurances. We will set out next week a firmer indicative timetable for further moves out of lockdown, including the reopening of the economy, and gyms and hairdressers, shops, hospitality will be included in that. Certainly I recognise the importance of gyms to people's physical and mental health, and I think that's reflected in the opening up of outdoor group exercise for adults today. So these things all really matter, and we want to get them done as quickly as possible, but as I keep saying, we will all regret it if we decide to run before we can walk and end up having to go back the way. So let's, frustrating and difficult though it is, let's keep with this slow, careful, cautious but steady pathway forward, and I think we'll find that we get to the end destination a lot more quickly than would otherwise be the case.
Thank you. Daniel Johnson, to be followed by Annabel Ewing.
NHS Lothian and the City of Edinburgh Council in particular continue to have amongst the lowest rates of vaccination in the country at 33.4% and 30.1% respectively, in comparison to the 40% figure that the First Minister quoted in her statement. It's several weeks since I first raised this issue in Edinburgh and the Lothians. So can I ask the First Minister what steps she is taking to identifying this continuing lag in Edinburgh and the Lothians, or indeed whether she has any insights on this matter? Certainly it's of great importance to my constituents and the citizens of Edinburgh.
First Minister.
Well, when I give average figures in the chamber, by definition, some health boards will be above that, some will be below that. All health boards are progressing with vaccination better and more quickly than we would have dared hope for back at the start of the year. So I think it's really important to give that context. I will ask NHS Lothian to engage with the member. I'm sure he's already in touch with them to set out whether they have any particular issues that they are dealing with. But all health boards are moving forward well and quickly with this, and all health boards are working to the same targets of having offered the first dose to everybody in the JCVI priority groups by mid-April, and of course then having given first doses to the whole adult population by the end of July. These are both target dates that are earlier than we anticipated at the start of the year. So I think it's really important to keep hold of that context.
Annabel Ewing, to be followed by Annie Wills.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. My Cowdenbeath constituents and indeed people across Scotland will be keen to better understand what may lie ahead in the months to come. So could the First Minister provide some information at least as to what the new criteria will be for the strategic framework levels approach, and also advise as to the planned frequency of the review of the levels decisions going forward? Thank you.
First Minister.
Well, I'll say more about this next week, and I don't want to get ahead of the decisions that we will take that will inform the statement I make next week. But when I made the statement 2 or 3 weeks ago, I set out the intention to realign some of the indicators we were using previously to inform decision making to be more in line with the current WHO guidance, to ensure that as we do open up, we have confidence that we're continuing to suppress the virus. We will review all of this on an ongoing basis, probably 3 weekly rather than weekly. And although we will have the ability to apply, should it be appropriate, different levels of restriction to different levels of the country, so that we're not forced into a one-size-fits-all approach in future, it is my hope that we can start to move down levels of restriction as a country, and that we make that progress overall. And that is why I think it's really important that we continue to stick to the guidance and the rules right now, so that that progress enables the whole country, all being well, to start to come out of lockdown together. As we look further ahead, if we have outbreaks, if we have localised flare-ups that we need to control, then the level system allows us to do that in a much more targeted way than if we simply had a one-size-fits-all approach for the whole country.
Thank you. Annie Wells, to be followed by Joan McAlpine.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, this is a critical time for hospices, with charity shops shut and fundraising events cancelled. Yet only £10 million of the £24 million made available by the UK Government has been passed on to hospices. This is despite promises that all funding would. Can I therefore ask the First Minister, when will this full funding allocation be passed on to hospices?
First Minister.
All of the funding that has been made available for hospices will be passed on to hospices. The balance of that will be confirmed soon. The reason for the delay in that is that we have found it challenging to obtain clarity as to the final consequential figure for hospices. In fact, the Department of Health and Social Care shared information with officials only at the end of February, which indicated that it is now estimated that £24 million has been provided for hospices, but we have not yet still had final confirmation of that from the UK Treasury. But let me be very clear to the hospice sector, every single penny of consequential funding that comes because of funding decisions for hospices elsewhere will be passed on to hospices here in Scotland.
Thank you. Joan McAlpine, to be followed by Liam MacArthur.
Thank you very much. I recently met with the Scottish Wedding Industry Alliance, an industry particularly important to Dumfries and Galloway. While they are grateful for the Scottish Government's support they have received, they ask for guidance on whether they can safely operate this summer. Many already have bookings. However, guidance by the Competitions and Markets Authority means that the cost of cancellation falls on the venue. They also point out that weddings of 20 people or less are not viable. So can the government offer guidance, and if it is not safe to reopen, is more support likely to be available?
First Minister.
Well, I hope it will be safe to reopen. As with anything else, we have a difficult balance to strike between economic viability and public safety, and obviously public safety has to take priority, but we do want to see marriage ceremonies with more guests and wedding receptions happen as soon as possible, and we will facilitate that in line with the public health advice that we have available. And of course, in the meantime, we'll continue to work closely with the Scottish Wedding Industry Alliance about as and when restrictions on ceremonies and receptions can be relaxed. We introduced a specific £25 million fund for the wedding sector. That closed at the end of February. It provided grants of up to £25,000 to businesses and self-employed people who operate in this sector, and we will set out more detail on future business support later this month. But our focus now, as far as we possibly can and as quickly as we possibly can, is to get businesses trading again. But that requires all of us to continue to play our part in suppressing the virus.
Thank you. Liam MacArthur, to be followed by Alistair Allen.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, I've been contacted by a constituent whose parents are in a care home in Orkney. She and her brother have had weekly indoor visits and been told outdoor visits for up to 6 people from 2 households would start this month. When my constituent asked if her daughter and granddaughter could visit, they were told no, as they were from a 3rd household. My parents feel imprisoned, said my constituent, who adds, all they want is to see their grandchildren before passing away, and they are losing the will to live because of these rules. First Minister, why in a community with such a low prevalence of COVID can visits like this not be permitted? And when does she expect further relaxation of rules so that care home residents in Orkney who are desperate to see their family members can have that contact?
First Minister.
Well, nobody, absolutely nobody wants to keep families apart for any longer than is necessary, and certainly we don't want to do that for no reason. I'm happy if Liam MacArthur wants to send me details of the constituents to ask the local health board to respond directly on the particular circumstances, and I understand absolutely the stress and the anxiety and the distress that is caused in these situations. The one point I would make, of course, and it is a general point, is that it has always been the case under the very difficult restrictions that have applied to care home visiting that end-of-life visiting has been allowed, as has certain other visiting in exceptional circumstances, which can and has included distress on the part of residents. So there may already be a conversation that should be had with the local health board and indeed the care home provider about whether or not that can be facilitated.
Thank you. Alistair Allen, to be followed by Oliver Mundell.
Thank you. The Western Isles has reached a significant milestone last week, with more than half of the adult population having had their first vaccination. NHS Western Isles staff and all who've helped them have done a fantastic job. We're also, however, in the midst of two significant outbreaks locally. All bus services were suspended in Lewis and Harris on Saturday, and there was some disruption to the Stornoway Allpool ferry due to a positive test. So can I ask the First Minister what steps are being taken to ensure the safety of key transport workers in similar situations around the country?
Well, there are and should continue to be a range of mitigations in place on public transport, and it's very important that those are robustly applied and monitored. In terms of vaccination, once we've offered vaccination to the priority groups 1 to 9, we will then continue to follow JCVI advice by inviting adults under 50 to come forward in age cohorts. That's supported by evidence that the risk of hospitalisation and critical care admission with COVID increases with age. So those at highest risk of hospitalisation outside of cohorts 1 to 9 will be those in the 40 to 49-year-old age groups. The other point here that I think it is important to make is that this is also the approach to vaccination that will allow us to vaccinate everybody most quickly. Logistically, if we were to take an approach that had to then try to identify people within different professions and occupations as opposed to identifying people on the basis of age, it would take longer to do that. So we will get through the whole adult population if we do it methodically by age cohort, and we will also have the biggest impact on illness and hospitalisations and death if we do it that way too.
Thank you. Oliver Mundell to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I have had concerns raised with me that vaccination teams in Dumfries and Galloway have been asked to slow down in order to let other areas of Scotland catch up. Can the First Minister confirm if the Scottish Government approved this request, and can she explain why vaccination rates could vary so significantly as to require this?
First Minister.
I am certainly not aware of that, and I'd be astonished if that was the case. I mean, you know, I know there's political divisions between different parties, but what possible interest do I or anybody else in the Scottish Government have in slowing down vaccination in any part of the country? I mean, it really doesn't make any sense. The rate, if there has been a slowing down, which there will have been in the past couple of weeks, if Oliver Mundell has been listening, he will know the answer to that. That has been because supplies have dipped. So that slowdown has happened across the country as supplies increase. In fact, it's happened across the whole UK. As that supply increases again from the middle of this month onwards, the daily rate of vaccination will increase as well. And as I said to Daniel Johnson, I think a moment or two ago, there will be geographic variations and that will sometimes be geographic. There are parts of the country, of course, that a few weeks ago were hit more than others with severe weather. So there will be some reasons why some parts of the country are slightly above average, some parts are slightly below average, but all parts of the country are ahead of where we, in our wildest dreams, would have hoped to be at this stage. This vaccination programme is going really well in all parts of the country, and we should be thankful to vaccinators across the length and breadth of Scotland for that.
Thank you, Stuart McMillan, to be followed by Pauline McNeill.
Finance Secretary's recent announcement that hospitality businesses will pay no rates for 12 months, whilst the UK Government only committed to 3 months. Can the First Minister confirm that this SNP Government will honour that commitment to those hospitality and tourism businesses, so they'll pay no rates for 12 months?
First Minister.
Yes, I can confirm that, assuming, of course, the Parliament votes for the budget later this afternoon. But the budget will ensure that retail, hospitality, leisure and aviation businesses will pay no rates, at least those businesses in Scotland will pay no rates during 2021-22. That will save ratepayers an estimated £719 million, and it responds to the key request that was made by the business community. In addition to that, of course, we have the lowest poundage in the UK, including an unprecedented reduction in the poundage mid-revaluation, returning it to pre-COVID levels, which will save Scottish businesses over £120 million compared with our previously published plans.
Thank you. Pauline McNeill to be followed by John Scott.
Further to the question asked by Joan McAlpine, MSPs heard on Friday that 20% of wedding venue owners had suicidal thoughts at the situation that they faced when they were surveyed. The industry outlined they had real concerns of the thousands of cancellations in the last few weeks. But they did say that the industry could bounce back quickly if they got the right help. Could I ask First Minister, in your discussions with the industry about a recovery plan, Could the recovery plan focus on specifically saving those venues from going bust? Because if we don't do that, then the many couples who've cancelled their weddings would not be able to rebook. And I think it's really important for the industry going forward.
First Minister.
Well, that will be a focus of ongoing support in different sectors for as long as that is needed, and I will make sure that is fed into the discussions that are ongoing with the wedding sector. But the most important thing we're trying to do is get businesses back trading, and that includes weddings with wedding receptions. It may be that for a period there are still some limitations on numbers, but we want to try to get back to normality there, just as we do everywhere else, as quickly as possible. Obviously for the benefit of the wedding sector, but also for the benefit of all these people across the country who want to get married and haven't been able to do so so far because of COVID.
Thank you. John Scott, to be followed by Neil Findlay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, long COVID appears to be an emerging and growing problem, and perhaps the First Minister could tell us how many cases there are in Scotland. Could the First Minister also tell us what measures the Scottish Government put in place to deal with long COVID, both in hospitals and in the community? And will additional financial resources be made available to both health boards and local authorities to support those unfortunate enough to have contracted long COVID if required?
First Minister.
Well, I can't answer definitively. I'll check whether we do have an estimated number of this for this, but I can't answer right now definitively how many people have long COVID, partly because we don't yet fully understand what it is, how it manifests, and how long long COVID turns out to be. The key thing that the Scottish Government is doing, as well as supporting health boards to make sure that there are services available for people presenting with the symptoms that appear to be indicative of long COVID, is investing in a lot of research work to try to better understand what it is, how it affects patients, and therefore what kind of specialisms might be required longer term to deal with it. So this is an extensive programme of work, and one that I expect we will be committed to for some time to come.
Thank you. And Neil Findlay.
West Lothian is consistently behind in vaccination rates, has been from the very beginning. Can I ask the First Minister what additional resources are being put in to try and increase the levels of vaccination in the area?
First Minister.
Well, all health boards have access to the same resources to get on with vaccination. I repeat the answer I've given before. I'm not aware of particular issues in West Lothian. I'll happily ask the Health Secretary to look into that. But all health boards are progressing well with vaccination, and the progress of the vaccination programme is beyond what we anticipated earlier this year. And there is a lot of focus from government, from health boards, local authorities and vaccination teams across the country to make sure that that progress continues.
Thank you very much. And that concludes that item of business. There will be a short pause before we move on. Short pause.
Thank you very much. The next item of business is a debate on motion 24300 in the name of Gillian Martin on the climate change plan. Can I invite members who wish to speak in this debate to press the request to speak buttons now? And I call on Gillian Martin to speak to and move the motion on behalf of the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I move the motion in my name. As convener of the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee, I welcome the opportunity to highlight the committee's recent report on the updated climate change plan and move the motion on behalf of the 4 committees that have jointly considered the plan. This collaborative scrutiny and the need for immediate action across a broad range of Cabinet Secretary and committee remits demonstrates the cross-cutting and integrated nature of effective climate policy action and scrutiny. It's an approach that must continue if we are to realise our ambitions. That scrutiny process has been informed by the invaluable contributions of experts, stakeholders and communities from across Scotland, and has been underpinned by our committee's work on a green recovery, and I would like to thank everyone who has contributed to our inquiry. Today represents an important opportunity to reflect on the strengths of the updated plan and to highlight some improvements needed to turn it into a credible and ambitious blueprint for Scotland's future. Our unanimously agreed report contains several action-focused recommendations, and we expect the Scottish Government to take these forward, together with those of the other committees, to deliver a final plan that we can all have confidence in. Sir David Attenborough recently told a virtual gathering of the UN Security Council that, and I quote, "Climate change is the biggest threat modern humans have ever faced." How we respond now will determine the world that our children and our grandchildren inherit. Parliament recognised the urgency of the situation in approving legislation that set new and ambitious targets, and it's clear that we need to increase and accelerate our action in the near term to meet them. Doing so offers clear potential for innovation, jobs, the economy, the environment, and for the well-being of the people of Scotland and beyond. We want to see Scotland at the forefront in exploring, developing and investing in these opportunities and in the technology that will help us reach our ambitious targets. That's why the updated plan must set the foundation and pathways for increased action across society. The committee recognises that we have very challenging targets and that the plan update has been prepared in challenging times. There's a significant level of support for the scale of the proposed emissions reductions and the overall ambition set out in the updated plan. In particular, we welcome the strengthened focus on cross-sectoral working and the inclusion of the coordinated approach, an approach that our committee has called for many years. However, we heard from our correspondents that detail on how to reach that ambition was lacking, and that concerns were raised over the achievability of the plan as set out. Major action and transformational change across all sectors and all parts of society is now urgently required to reflect the nature of the climate emergency, meet our Climate Change Act ambition, and to capture the immediate opportunities of a green recovery. We need to tackle the implementation gap, where solutions have already been identified but not so far applied. And we must capture and lock in positive behaviours and to build resilience through valuing nature more. Underpinning this all, we must focus on people, innovation, skills and jobs. The pandemic has shown that we can act boldly and quickly in the face of a crisis. But, as David Attenborough says, climate change is the biggest crisis facing humanity today, and our response must reflect that. Let me now move on to our recommendations, including those on the modelling and evidence used, the balance of effort across sectors, sectoral plans and governance arrangements, and on behaviour change. The committee has called on the Scottish Government to demonstrate how the policies and proposals deliver the envelopes presented for each sector. Understanding the relative emissions abatement significance of the policies and proposals is key to supporting the implementation of the plan, and this enables potential risks and deficiencies to be identified and corrected. We've also called for better clarity on the timescales associated with policy and proposal commitments in the plan to develop, consult, research or explore particular measures. The timescales should reflect the urgent nature of the climate emergency and the immediate opportunities to progress our green recovery. We would also like a review on the assumptions underpinning the plan, particularly the abatement attributed to negative emission technologies, or NETs. Given the uncertainties associated with this, we've called on the Scottish Government to set out an alternative plan for how equivalent abatement could be achieved. And we've also asked for greater detail on how the policies and proposals across all sectors reflect the opportunities and implications associated with just transition, and green recovery, taking into account regional considerations. We've also recommended that the final updated plan must take a more integrated approach to cutting emissions across agriculture and land use, recognising that both depend on the management of a single resource and that these sectors are expected to become more closely aligned in policy and practice. The detail of our report makes clear and detailed recommendations across a range of other areas, including waste and the circular economy, nature-based solutions and blue carbon. Now, the committee recognises that what we're debating today is an updated plan, and time for scrutiny has been tight, and updates are never going to be as comprehensive or detailed as a complete new plan. But I'd like to now look forward to the fourth climate change plan. First of all, stakeholders and the Parliament do need ample time to consider the detail contained in a new climate change plan, and the committee therefore calls on the Government to lay the next full climate change plan in Parliament by the end of 2023. And that will ensure that there is sufficient time for full stakeholder and parliamentary consideration before finalisation and publication of the fourth climate change plan in 2024. Now, this will be the last debate led by the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform in this parliamentary session, and it's fair to say that's the culmination of a very heavy work schedule in this session. It's been a privilege to convene a committee dealing with such vital work, and I'd like to pay tribute to the extremely hard work of the committee clerks and our Spice Research colleagues. And we also have two long-serving members of the committee retiring and making their last speeches today. That's Stuart Stevenson and Angus MacDonald. And I'd like to put on record my best wishes and thanks to them, as well as all the members who have served with such dedication on the committee throughout this session. And it's sad today that today was potentially the Cabinet Secretary's last debate as well, and she's unable to be here, but I wish her a speedy recovery and thank her for the constructive way she's worked with our committee and for her many years of public service, not least in her stewardship in protecting the environment and tackling climate change. Both our committee members and the Cabinet Secretary know that there is no precedent in human history for the speed and scale of change needed to tackle climate change and reduce harmful emissions. The changes highlighted across 4 parliamentary committees who've come together today will help to ensure that the final updated climate change plan proves an effective response to the current challenges, and our recommendations should help provide a springboard for the swift action needed to tackle climate change and to deliver a truly green recovery for Scotland, a recovery where no one is left behind, and it's only by committing to significant action today that we can build a better Scotland for tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on Edward Mighton to speak on behalf of the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee. 6 minutes, Mr Mighton, to be followed by James Dornan.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. As convener of the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee, I'm pleased to contribute to this debate. We took evidence for the climate change plan during January and February of this year, and the committee's call for written evidence produced a good level of responses. I'm grateful to all those who contributed to the scrutiny process. Now, we wrote to the Scottish Ministers on the 4th of March, setting out a series of specific recommendations for improvement of the plan in areas covered by the committee's remit. Our work has been particularly important given that transport and agriculture sectors are the highest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions in Scotland. On transport emissions, the objective of reducing transport emissions by 41% between 2020 and 2023 is certainly ambitious, particularly since these have not fallen over the last decade. Indeed, many stakeholders expressed doubt that this objective was achievable. To address these concerns, the committee has called on the Scottish Government to introduce enhanced monitoring, increased interim targets, and much greater clarity regarding the alignment of specific transport policy measures with the timescale for achieving the reduction in transport emissions. Probably the most significant transport-related element of the CCPU is the target to reduce car kilometres by 20% by 2030. The UK Climate Change Committee told us that even in its most ambitious assessment, it could not identify a set of policy measures that would achieve this level of reduction. Furthermore, the REC Committee has emphasised that particular challenges faced by remote and rural areas of Scotland in reducing car kilometres, given the limited availability of public transport and the slow rollout of electric vehicle charging infrastructure in these areas. Policy measures in the forthcoming route map for meeting this target will therefore need to be extremely ambitious and realistic in addressing these specific challenges. On electric vehicles, the planned phase out of new petrol and diesel vehicles, cars and vans to be achieved, it is critically important to address the current grid capacity constraints. The committee is urging the Scottish Government to set out a timescale for the complete phase-out of hybrid vehicles as well. On freight transport, we have heard evidence of the huge opportunity for reducing carbon emissions in freight transport by shifting from road to rail. We're therefore disappointed by a lack of emphasis on this in the plan and of addressing freight transport and harnessing that opportunity. On active travel, the increasing need to encourage active travel must be a key future priority, although I note that certain previous targets on active travel have been missed by a significant amount. We must therefore ensure that growth in active travel during the COVID-19 pandemic is embedded in the long-term psyche of the people of Scotland. On new rural policy, agricultural stakeholders have highlighted the lack of urgency in the timetable for bringing forward a new rural policy for Scotland and in rolling out regional land use partnerships. For planned reductions in carbon emissions from the agricultural sector to be achieved, these timescales must be significantly accelerated. On data research, training and advice, many... Yes, I will.
John Scott.
I thank Edward Mountain for taking an intervention and declaring an interest as a farmer. Would Edward Mountain agree with me that there's a huge willingness across Scotland in both the transport and agricultural sector to meet these challenges? However, would he also agree with me that there's a huge need for knowledge transfer for those who know how to make this work to those who will have to make this work? And that is a gap in the provision at the moment that needs to be filled.
Edward Mountain.
I thank Mr Scott for that intervention and timely reminding me as a farmer. I should also declare my interest in the fact that I want to see farming move forward. And I would like to say that Mr Scott is entirely right, because farmers need to be supported through the appropriately funded expansion of the Farm Advisory Service. In particular, we need to look at how we can increase the take-up of carbon audits quickly and significantly. On forestry, the UK Climate Change Committee gave notable praise to the targets and accompanying action plan for forestry. Our committee has concluded to maximise the environmental benefits of planting new woodlands. A 50-50 split between native and commercial species must be sustained in the long term. Beyond the current target of planting 18,000 hectares of new woodland annually by 2025, there is scope to achieve a longer-term target of 24,000 hectares per year, and the Scottish Government should develop a workable plan to achieve that goal. Sorry, Mr Lyle, did you want to interrupt?
Yes, Richard Lyle.
I actually wonder what England is doing, because I noticed that Scotland planted 80% of the total and England only planted 20% of the total.
Edward Mountain.
And Mr Lyle makes an important intervention if he was in the UK Parliament. We are in the Scottish Parliament, and I will concentrate on the Scottish Climate Plan. So turning to food, stakeholders emphasise the importance of taking a whole food system approach to cutting emissions in the agriculture sector. The delayed Good Food Nation Bill would have provided an important framework for such an integrated approach, and this bill now needs to be brought forward urgently and no later than before the end of 2021. Now, Presiding Officer, in this brief summary, some of the key recommendations from the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee, and I hope the Scottish Government will give careful consideration to all the committee's recommendations. Presiding Officer, before I go, I will finish on this particular subject. The convener of the Eclair Committee mentioned that she was losing some members from her committee who had contributed. I too share losing Angus MacDonald and Stuart Stevenson, but I also will be sad to see Maureen Watt, Richard Lyle and John Finney go, as well as Peter Chapman. So I have perhaps been more remiss than the convener of the REC committee, the Eclair Committee, because I have lost more members. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on James Dornan to speak on behalf of the Local Government and Communities Committee, to be followed by Willie Coffey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I welcome the opportunity to talk on behalf of the Local Government and Communities Committee about the draft Climate Change Plan update. Initially, we agreed to focus on the buildings chapter within the updated plan, and this centred around planning and building. Our scrutiny also looked at how local government plays a role in helping achieve the target. I'd like to take this opportunity to give my thanks to the committee's clerking team and to those who have given us written and oral evidence. And I also pay my tribute to the work of the fellow committees that scrutinised the updated plan who we are hearing from today. And I hope that there's none of my committee members that are leaving that I've forgotten to wish well in the future. I will point out that the committee took evidence before the Scottish Government released their draft heat and building strategy published in February. The strategy does shed light on some of the issues raised by the updated plan. I also note the ongoing pandemic contributed to the delay in its publication. The breadth of ambition set out in the proposals, whilst recognised as challenging, is also one of the main strengths of the update. The proposals were well received and supported by our witnesses. However, we did hear that the updated plan lacked detail. Stakeholders and the public need to understand the stepping stones required to guide them towards the outcomes. Bringing down heat emissions from building is a challenging task, and the public play a vital role in tackling this. Clear, effective communication will help drive the behavioural change we need to see home by home. The committee welcomes the government's commitment to implement a public engagement strategy for heat decarbonisation. We believe people should feel informed and empowered, and that they can be part of the solution. The update states that the Scottish Government will introduce a standard requiring all new homes rented from 2024 to use zero emissions heating. But we hear of a time lag existing from when new regulations are introduced to when they start to have the effect on the ground. We've asked the Scottish Government to respond to views we heard that the date of the implementation of this standard should be brought forward to 2022. We understand a high percentage of modern buildings are failing to meet the minimum building standards regulations, and the current design life of a new home build is approximately 60 years. For past generations built home to last 100 and 200 years. We heard a proposal for a building's MOT for new builds, with emissions monitored at least every 5 years. The committee asked the Scottish Government to clarify what other opportunities are available to tighten up building standards and to ensure we build durable buildings. We understand the updated plan does not consider embodied energy. This is the total carbon footprint involved in construction or refurbishment, adding up the impact of labour, cement, steel, wood or other materials used, and all related transport impacts measured in carbon. The committee would be interested to know if the updated plan takes account of embodied energy costs. Once it is agreed that reducing the carbon footprint of existing homes is one of the biggest challenges under the plan. Scotland has a diverse range of homes, and much of this is older housing stock. Houses in rural areas bring particular challenges. We heard rural buildings are often seen as too difficult, too expensive, too hard, or too complicated. With this comes the need for increased financial support, and we therefore welcome proposals to extend financial support in rural areas. We ask for more details on how homeowners will be incentivised and persuaded that improvements are in their interest. The committee also believes more detail is needed in the practicalities of rolling out improvements across Scotland's diverse housing stock. We heard evidence of improvements to homes which in fact made living conditions worse. We recognise introducing improvements as a developing discipline. However, witnesses welcome the emphasis on training and upskilling in the updated plan. The committee believes sharing good practice is essential to progress in this area. Scotland has around 800,000 tenement buildings, and we've noted the Scottish Government is committed to these tenements reaching a good level of energy efficiency. However, we believe law on common repairs in tenements must be reformed, to help expedite interventions that will improve energy efficiency. We were disappointed to note that the 255-page plan has only one page expressly dedicated to planning. We were told the plan misses the point about the role of place, how people travel between and use those building accounts for a larger amount of green gas emissions than the buildings themselves. The committee therefore supports calls for a national policy focus on place, well-being and the delivery of related policy goods. We heard the current planning system must be adapted for it to become more reactive and a mechanism for flexible dialogue between the people, the developers and government. We recommend local authorities must be supported to provide effective public engagement and planning. As the nation moves towards a net zero society, the crucial role of local government in coordinating communities and public life must be recognised. We heard there's a need to upskill staff across all local authorities. This means not only funding, but also increased organisational capacity to meet this challenge. We've asked for a local government training strategy to upskill the workforce. And we welcome the commitment to work with local government to design solutions tailored to their circumstances. However, we also ask the government to consider increased flexibility of funding to also allow each local authority to meet the needs unique to their area in relation to decarbonisation. And finally, Presiding Officer, I look forward now to hearing the Ministers and the Cabinet Secretaries respond to the points raised by all committees and hope that many of these challenges will be addressed in the next parliamentary session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on Willie Coffey to speak on behalf of the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee, to be followed by Ben McPherson.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer, and I'm pleased to be speaking today on behalf of my committee. We considered three aspects of the climate change plan update: electricity, industry and nets. That is the negative emissions technologies that have been mentioned earlier. I'd like to highlight a handful of points under each of these headings, if I may. First of all, I want to say something about an earlier piece of work that we did, because we reported on the findings of our energy inquiry last summer. And I believe the idea of the energy quadrilemma warrants repeating in this debate. It's crucial, we were told, to strike a balance between a quartet of potentially competing factors, those being climate change, security of supply, affordability, and public acceptability, which basically means we should be asking ourselves where our energy comes from, how we use it, how responsible we are for what we consume. The aim here, of course, is to reduce carbon emissions and choose the best options available for us to achieve that. Scotland has almost halved its greenhouse gas emissions in 30 years, and that's really pretty good going. Now we just need to do it again in the next 11. That comes with challenges, Presiding Officer, but it brings opportunities too. The challenges for electricity take the form of planning, grid connection and charging. However, we have a number of comparative advantages as well. We have the workforce with oil and gas and renewables. We have natural assets, wind, hydroelectric, wave and tidal power. And we also have policy momentum with COP26 taking place in Glasgow later in the year. Key point from our evidence was the importance of alignment. Otherwise, we reduce the chances of renewable energy contributing to a green recovery. Now, a year ago, 3 of our committee members visited Orkney for our energy inquiry and witnessed the integration of generation, use and storage in the form of the Reflex project. What we would like to see now in terms of monitoring is a tool within the annual energy statement. And we suggest that statement could be a standalone document, one that can show progress made in a meaningful, prominent and accessible way for policymakers, parliamentarians and the public too. When it came to industry, Presiding Officer, it was disappointing not to hear directly from INEOS. The company is such a significant player in the sector. That was not to be, but we did hear on its behalf from the Chemical Industries Association. Now, they told us about the high operational costs of decarbonising, and they were blunt about the risks of carbon leakage. Leakage not in the technical sense, but the potential economic loss if businesses and jobs were to move elsewhere. That is just the economics of it, they reminded us. We recommend, therefore, that the Scottish Government prioritise this aspect of its policy around incentive, support and competitiveness, and that it continues to work in partnership with the industry. We also encourage our successor committee next session focus on industrial decarbonisation. Third and final strand of our work, Presiding Officer, was on negative emissions technologies. These are technologies that can permanently remove carbon from the atmosphere, and it's fair to say expectations on this front are ambitious. Chris Stark reckoned what was being set out by the Scottish Government was entirely feasible, but subject to there being significant investment and political and commercial willpower. He said that developments would have to happen at scale and a Scottish site needed to be established by 2029. We were told Scotland has the geology, the skills and the infrastructure, and so we're well placed to lead on this. However, some of our evidence voiced concern at what was seen as the lack of an alternative strategy. Our Minister, Mr Wheelhouse, sought to balance risks and rewards between government, industry and consumers, and he spoke of a place-based approach. A number of witnesses said the cost of decarbonisation should be spread fairly across society, and Mr Wheelhouse stressed the importance of partnership working. He praised initiatives such as the Grangemouth Future Industry Board, the Scottish Industrial Decarbonisation Partnership, and the North East Carbon Capture, Usage and Storage Initiative, or NECUS to its friends. But our committee welcomes the importance placed upon these partnerships. Business and community buy-in must be an essential part of our plans, but we would like to see a little more detail on the 2032 target for gross emissions. And we recommend the Scottish Government prepare and publish an industrial roadmap that will take us there. So these were just a few of our own findings, Presiding Officer, and I hope they chime with the findings of our other committees, and I look forward to hearing more later this afternoon, and of course hearing from the Government as the debate winds up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on Ben Macpherson on behalf of the Scottish Government, to be followed by Liz Smith.
Good afternoon, Presiding Officer, and I am also glad to speak in this important debate on the Climate Change Plan update, and also thank the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee for sponsoring today's debate, and for all the committees that have been involved in the scrutiny process, and indeed for 4 important speeches from the conveners this afternoon. Firstly, as Gillian Martin alluded to, I would like to start by acknowledging that the Cabinet Secretary is unfortunately unable to be here, having been unwell recently. But don't worry, for clarity, it's not COVID. Rosanna, more than anyone, will be suitably annoyed at having to miss Parliament, not just because this might well have been her final debate and speeches before her retirement, but because the Climate Change Plan update is something she has championed for the last few years. Her commitment to delivering on our ambitious targets is second to none, and so, although she cannot be here today, I think the whole Chamber would acknowledge the contribution she has made to getting us this far. Presiding Officer, Scotland has made great progress in reducing our emissions. The Committee on Climate Change recently highlighted that we have decarbonised faster than the rest of the UK and any G20 economy since 2008. In 2019, we enshrined in law world-leading targets, including net zero emissions by 2045, and committed to update the 2018 Climate Change Plan. However, none of us could have imagined back then the circumstances in which this update would be published. COVID-19 has had a devastating impact on lives and livelihoods across Scotland, as we know. However, there are brighter times ahead. And out of the pandemic, we must secure a green recovery and a just transition to net zero. Because, of course, the global climate emergency has not gone away. If anything, it has become an even more pressing issue. And it reminds me of when I was in China in 2003, when the first SARS pandemic hit. And I heard a saying that was, "The virus is the greatest concern to humankind, except for humankind itself." And I think that really epitomises the situation that we're in now with regard to our focus on the climate emergency as well as the pandemic. The plan we're considering today, the plan update, sets an ambitious path to meet Scotland's targets up to 2032, including 100 new policies, in line with the requirements of Section 36 of the Climate Change Act. The policy package was also designed to make up for the excess emissions that arose from the missed 2017 and 2018 annual targets. The plan update was signed by all Cabinet Secretaries, the whole of the Cabinet, reflecting the cross-government approach recommended by the ECCLR Committee. Furthermore, our new coordinated approach chapter accounts for the interlinkages between sectors. And given the complexities involved, the plan update commits to learning by doing, as recommended by our stakeholders. It refreshes the monitoring framework from the 2018 plan, and annual reporting to Parliament on progress will begin in May. We have also included an additional sector chapter for negative emissions technologies, which reflects our recognition, in line with the advice of the CCC, that these technologies will be essential. Most importantly, though, our new and boosted policies and proposals will reduce emissions across all sectors. Indeed, while giving evidence at committee, Chris Stark of the CCC said that the plan update is really impressive in breadth, noting there is no UK equivalent. The transition to net zero will require many transformational shifts that need to take place in the next decade. Therefore, the plan update commits us to significant immediate action. For example, our farmer-led groups will secure uptake of low-emissions farming measures. We are rapidly implementing the beef sector group's recommendations, and the groups on arable, dairy and hill, upland and crofting are aiming to report in the spring. Last month, we announced our regional land use partnership pilot regions to optimise land use in a fair and inclusive way, and we have also increased our ambition with regards to nature-based solutions, with targets to restore 20,000 hectares of peatland per annum and increase new woodland creation by 50% by 2025. Furthermore, we will reduce car kilometres by 20% by 2030 and will seek to publish a strategy on this later this year. We will also ensure that by 2030, half of our homes have transitioned to low and zero carbon heating systems, with the recent Heat and Buildings strategy laying out our delivery plans in more detail. And in the waste sector, we will reduce food waste by 33% by 2025. The commitments in the plan update are backed up by record levels of funding, including £1.9 billion announced in the budget. This includes the first £165 million of our low-carbon fund, with £14 million for the Green Jobs Fund, £25 million for bus priority infrastructure and £15 million for zero-emissions buses. We also recently published our infrastructure investment plan, supporting an inclusive net zero carbon economy and detailing over £26 billion of major projects and large programmes. And the publication of the plan update, of course, comes at a timely moment for climate action worldwide. Ahead of COP26 in Glasgow, we have the opportunity to showcase Scotland's world-leading approach to climate change, and we will use COP26 to help drive tangible international climate action. Presiding Officer, colleagues, Though there will undoubtedly be uncertainties as we transition to net zero, technological advances, the limits of devolution and the need to ensure a just transition, we are confident that the plan update provides a credible pathway to meeting our targets. It sends out a clear statement of intent, providing greater certainty for all parts of society to contribute further to mitigating climate change. I want to thank the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee for their report and recommendations, alongside those of the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee, the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee and the Local Government and Communities Committee. This progress is invaluable. We, the Scottish Government, will consider this advice and respond in due course, bearing in mind that there is an urgent need to finalise the plan update so that we can focus on the implementation of its policies and deliver our targets, including reducing emissions by 75% by 2030. We therefore plan to finalise the current plan update before recess. We will then look for opportunities to integrate additional policies into our overall package in due course, and this includes any new policies in response to our full consideration of the committee's recommendations, as well as the outcome of our review into the impact of technological updates to the measurement of emissions from wetlands. And ministers will make a statement in June following the publication of the next set of greenhouse gas emission statistics, and we will look for other opportunities to keep Parliament informed of our approach. So, Presiding Officer, I hope what I've said is useful in setting out the Scottish Government's positions and approach, and we look forward to continuing to work with fellow MSPs and others, and I look forward to the rest of today's debate. Thank you.
Thank you. I call on Liz Smith to be followed by Claudia Beamy.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and can I begin by offering the good wishes from the Conservatives for a very speedy recovery to Rosanna Cunningham. But can I also say, given that this would have been her last debate, that I also would like to pay tribute to her over a long period of time. We come from extremely different political stables, as I think everybody knows, but we've been adversaries in Perthshire for quite some time. She is a formidable politician, and I think she's given great service to both Westminster and to Holyrood over the time. So I wish her a very happy retirement. Deputy Presiding Officer, I think we would all accept that this has been all too easy during the pandemic to forget about the enormity of the challenge which we face when it comes to tackling climate change. And it is the scale of that challenge, together with the worryingly short timescales, which has focused the minds of several committees in this chamber over recent months. And it is also why the report is fairly blunt from the Eclair Committee in its analysis of the work that the next Parliament will have to do. Chris Stark, who's already been mentioned, is definitely one of the most respected advisers on climate change, and he described the Scottish Government's ambitions as being on, and I quote, the fringes of credibility. And I agree with Chris Stark on that point, but that's not to say that the Scottish Government's ambitions are wrong. Far from it. But there are serious question marks over the deliverability of certain key targets, most especially if we look at some of the SNP's most recent record. So it is that question over deliverability which we will be concentrating on in this debate. There are key issues which need to be addressed if Scotland, when it comes to COP26 in a few months' time, is going to be able to demonstrate that she is a world leader when it comes to addressing climate change. Firstly, the strong message coming from many of the witnesses that we heard, and which is highlighted by the Eclair Committee, is that much more has to be done to drive a holistic policy approach, the one that was described by the Minister. Too much of the climate change debate has been taking place within different silos, perhaps that's understandable, and I provide just 3 examples of that. Firstly, we know that there have been very significant differences in progress to net zero within the 8 sectors. For example, the water industry and domestic heat and buildings have been doing very well, but transport much less so. Has enough been done to ascertain why certain sectors have been making more progress than others? Probably not, although I do accept the Cabinet Secretary's recent remarks that some of the difference was down to the different pace of technological change. That's a fair comment, but it is not the whole story. For example, if we accept that green transport is a key priority, and I've heard the Cabinet Secretary say this many times, particularly in relation to buses, then I do question why the SNP would decide to cut 33 million out of this year's rail infrastructure budget. That doesn't make sense to me. Secondly, we heard quite a lot of criticism at committee about the absence of a universal approach to regional land partnerships, something which has consistently been raised by the NFUS. They felt that there was too much of a disjointed approach to agriculture and forestry and questioned why the regional land partnerships policy had to be on a pilot basis only, when it's quite clear that there has been very successful elsewhere, delivering substantial improvements in biodiversity and financial economies of scale. And thirdly, concerns have been raised about the ability to link urban and rural policy. Several witnesses made the point that they felt climate change plan did not reflect the needs of different regions sufficiently well, and I think that's something we need to address as soon as possible. Without any question, priority has to be placed on the introduction of the Circular Economy Bill promised by the SNP as a flagship piece of legislation. That bill is absolutely critical to the climate change plan, so it was disappointing that it had to be delayed, and I'm sure my colleague Maurice Golden will say a bit more about this in his summing up. Let me turn now to what I see as some of the more difficult and pressing challenges we face, challenges with which the Eclair Committee has been wrestling over recent weeks. Firstly, there is the issue of behaviour change and how easy it will be to deliver this change with the encouragement and incentives rather than by more punitive measures. We all know that consumer behaviour has to change if we are to hit more climate change targets. And we may already have done some of what's necessary to reduce the use of plastic, to improve the heating in our homes, to ensure that we're buying greener cars, to address some problems of landfill, but there is an awful lot more to be done. And that's where I think things get difficult. To what extent, for example, should we be taxing consumers in order to effect the changes that we want to see? To what extent should government dictate to us what expectations there are on consumer behaviour? And to what extent should economic policy become more statist in its approach? Should there be continuing conflicts between the private and public sectors? These are all very complex issues, raising questions about tax revenues, procurement, indeed the role of government in society, and we can't run away from them. The committee has touched on most of these issues, but I do think that the next Parliament is going to have to take this forward. Secondly, there is the issue of striking a balance, and nowhere is this more important in our approach to nature. We should acknowledge the huge progress that has been made in many respects, and I pay tribute to the Cabinet Secretary again for her own efforts, particularly with peatlands, but there are some very worrying features of this debate too. And I will put on record here my very deep-seated concern at the way that a small minority of so-called environmentalists have attacked many whose lifeblood is the countryside. The recent attacks on gamekeepers, on gillies, on stalkers, for doing their job in maintaining and enhancing our countryside have been reprehensible, just as have been the comments from a small minority who quite clearly ignore our responsibility to outlaw raptor crime. The approaches of these small but nonetheless very vocal minorities are born out of prejudice and ignorance, and I deplore the lack of reasoned debate, often flouting the available evidence about the activities they undertake, most especially those when they have done so much to improve biodiversity. The same is true for the stewardship of our beauty spots. Scotland is so rich in its natural assets, and if there has been any silver lining within the very dark COVID cloud, it is that many people want to enjoy them. But that comes with responsibility, and that means much tougher action to weed out the fly tippers, the litter louts, and the antisocial campers. Presiding Officer, the scale of the climate change challenge we face is immense. And I wonder sometimes if this Parliament, if we've been devoting enough time in the Chamber to debating climate change policy. I appreciate that the pandemic has made similar demands on debating time, but I look at some of the debates that we've had and I wonder just if we've got our priorities right. A debate about which flags we fly outside this building would surely have been one of them that we could have done without. And so I hope in the next Parliament we will be able to prioritise much more on climate change, far more than has been the case in this Parliament.
Thank you very much. I now call Claudia Beamish to be followed by Liam MacArthur.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I start by wishing the Cabinet Secretary well, as others have already, in every sense of the word. It is indeed unfortunate that she cannot be here to take part in today's debate, it possibly being her last, and I pay Scottish Labour's respects to her long-standing contribution to this brief. I also want to wish Sarah Boyack well in her new post as our spokesperson for climate change, environment and land reform. May I say that her acumen and experience, in my view, on all these fundamentally significant issues will serve Scotland well. Today she will be focusing on the role of local government leadership and funding. Richard Leonard will tackle the issue of just transition and jobs, and probably, I hope as well, how the skills strategy is vital. We must not miss the opportunities as we slowly move out of COVID. We are indeed in a declared climate emergency and a nature emergency which is inextricably linked to this. There is an urgent need for rapid, clearly planned action across all sectors to meet the 2030 targets fairly, but the Scottish Government simply is not clear enough on the detail of many of its policies. I and other members will come to this from both committee and party perspectives, and indeed some have already. However, I want to start by focusing on the global imperative. Today, at the Eclair Committee, of which I'm a member, we took evidence from the Scottish Government team working on Scotland's involvement in the Glasgow Summit, COP26. I want to make some brief comments about this opportunity and stress how fundamentally important the framing is. This is fundamentally our collective deliberations about the climate change plan. But I have to say that the Climate Change Act of 2019 was strengthened by some of Scottish Labour's amendments and those of others in relation to the Global South and our responsibility as a developed nation to pay our fair share. And also there was an expectation in the Act that how to reference the regard to the climate justice principle. And vitally, I quote from the Act, proposals and policies for supporting, including by sharing of expertise and technology, action in developing countries to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases and adapt to the effect of climate change. And I'm going to quote from one of our comments from the Eclair Committee, of which I'm a member. While the committee recognises it is an update to the 2018 climate change plan and therefore we're not legally bound to incorporate the requirements set out in the Act, the committee expected the Scottish Government would seek to reflect these provisions as far as it was possible to do so. The committee is concerned that the draft climate change plan update does not include a number of these actions as identified in the 2019 Act. I hope the Minister will take note of this today, and these concerns will be expressed in the final updated plan. I now turn to our recommendations on blue carbon. Our convener, Gillian Martin, in her letter to the Cabinet Secretary on the 4th of March on publication of our report, pointed out, and I quote, "The committee notes that the plan is now being prepared in the run-up to COP26 in November, where international emissions targets will be reviewed. Prior to this, I strongly ask that the Scottish Government push the case with the UK Government for the inclusion of blue carbon in the inventory, as per our recommendation from the committee 192. And I quote, it would appear to the committee that acting on the basis of the precautionary principle, taking a proactive approach to blue carbon and including it as part of the the climate change plan update would ensure that, Scotland makes early advances and secures multiple benefits in terms of carbon storage, securing biodiversity and supporting adaptation and resilience in many areas that are relatively simple, low-cost actions. And I hope the Minister and indeed the Cabinet Secretary will take this on board. She has shown robust leadership in the development of peatland action, and I hope that this will be the case with blue carbon as well. We don't have to wait. And a brief comment on peat to pass to the Cabinet Secretary, please. That our recommendation 162 provides further detail on the mechanisms that should be used to phase out the use of horticultural peat, on the assessment of how existing sites for peat extraction will impact on land use and that envelope, and emphasises a presumption against extensions to existing sites. I turn now to the issue of incineration and energy from waste, and I ask the Scottish Government to explore this issue with great care, as is highlighted by the committee. Our recommendation 129 states, review and coordinate the planning and procurement of incineration capacity to avoid lock-in. And I stress, it is, at its most simple, no more capacity, no more demand. And in a more positive vein, I turn to the circular economy, so important in the future of our jobs for Scotland and the climate change plan. And our 128 recommendation include a recommitment to the Circular Economy Bill to set out a framework for a transition to a circular economy. So, finally, Chris Stark, who I also refer to and greatly respect, suggested that while the Scottish ministers have responded to the principles that the Climate Change Committee set out and to their recommendations, this does not go far enough. And the response needs to be framed to the economic crisis we are facing as we come out of the pandemic to ensure that we achieve a green recovery. So to this I would simply add, finally, the evidence of the global threat is stark. Let's do all we can here in Scotland to help keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees and lead by example in the run-up to COP26. A really robust climate change plan update with route maps in all sectors, underpinned by a just transition, could do just this. Thank you.
Thank you. I call Liam MacArthur to be followed by Mark Ruskell.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I offer my good wishes to all those members for whom this is their final parliamentary debate and share the disappointment that the Cabinet Secretary cannot be with us participating this afternoon. She has not only shown a commitment to the climate change, but as Liz Smith reminded us, has always been a minister who has been approachable and collaborative in her approach. And while I learnt the hard way the risks of taking an intervention from Stuart Stevenson, and I've not entirely forgiven him for redirecting one of Orkney's lifeline ferries off to Norway. I feel strangely privileged to be here for his final contribution and look forward to the remarkable word count that I'm sure he will appraise us of later on this afternoon. Deputy Presiding Officer, can I also offer thanks to all 4 committees for their diligence in robustly scrutinising this updated plan. The reports capture a vast amount of knowledge, expertise and experience from a wide range of witnesses, to whom I also offer thanks. As a result, today's debate, I think, can only really aspire to being a whistle-stop tour, but hopefully these reports provide reassurance that this Parliament recognises the importance, the urgency and the scale of the challenge at hand. Indeed, as the Local Government Committee observed, the word challenge hardly seems sufficient. I also find myself in agreement with the Eclair Committee colleagues in welcoming the greater emphasis in the updated plan of the role for nature-based solutions. This is something Scottish Liberal Democrats strongly support. For all the innovative technologies we must and will invest in, a diverse ecosystem offers the surest means of storing carbon and reducing emissions. Moreover, the potential for green job creation through restoration and management work is significant. RSPB estimate around 8,500 full-time equivalent jobs could be created, and this is an opportunity, therefore, that cannot be passed up. But the Eclair Committee also warned that 1 million hectares of peatland are degraded in some form or other. The committee goes on to express concern, quite rightly, that historically the Scottish Government has had greater success in reaching tree planting targets than reaching peatland restoration targets. I'm sure Mr Lyle will update us on the UK Government's performance there, but for obvious reasons, Presiding Officer, that needs to change. The lack of multi-year funding is perhaps a more recognised and well-established problem, and in the face of a climate emergency, we cannot miss targets and opportunities through an inability to plan, a lack of certainty and an overabundance of bureaucracy. Can I also associate myself with the important points made by the Local Government Committee colleagues about linking work to eradicate fuel poverty with efforts to reduce the carbon footprint of housing and buildings. This was a theme, of course, that was picked up during the passage recently of the Heat Networks Bill. Orkney is one of 7 local authorities with significantly higher fuel poverty and extreme fuel poverty rates well beyond the national average. Despite the government declaring energy efficiency a national priority before the last election, we seem no closer to addressing